If you're thinking about it, we're talking about it here on Moral Side of the News. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me, as always, is a distinguished panel on this program. Rabbi Joe Rooks, Rapport, the Temple. Reverend David Harkleroad, South Point Church, New Albany. Reverend Clay Calloway, West Louisville Ministers Coalition. And Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. Our first topic on this program, football is back. College and NFL stadiums are filling with fans, and now there's a new spectator, legalized sports gambling in Kentucky. So, panel, turning to you, are you a fan, or do you think this idea should have been sidelined?
Well, I like the intro again, John. You set it up perfectly using the correct metaphors there. Gambling, let's just be clear, gambling is a vice, not a virtue. Now, some good can come from it, but it is a vice. And some good can by some measure, can come from it. Unlike the lotto in Kentucky, it was created almost exclusively to supplement the educational system in the state. I don't think the gaming, the new gaming law and enterprise is going to have such a benevolent mission as the lotto system. So I think that there's some cause for pause. Many were doing it anyway out of state. So it's a way to help, I guess, retain funds that was leaving the state for sports gaming. In that regard, I see some value, even though I question the virtue of it, I do see some value in it. So it's here. We'll see what happens. You know, gaming's betting was the reason that the great Pete Rose was not allowed to get in the Hall of Fame. So that ought to tell you something. The scripture does say this. It doesn't talk specifically about gambling, but God adds blessings without adding a curse. Typically, gaming seems like more curse than blessing to a society with gambling addictions and the like. So I'm not a big fan of it, even though some good may be squeezed out of it. Even a lemon can give you some lemonade, but I think that it is indeed a vice that you know some may view as some value to the economy, and I question that.
Well, you captured my thoughts exactly. I don't think gambling is inherently evil, and again, in these situations, I see where there are some arguments for positives, where the state will bring in some income. But I think, as we've observed over the years, generally gambling is a net negative for a society. There's a lot of ways we could observe that just looking around us, but it tends to hurt the vulnerable. It's not the ideal way to bring in state income. And I just think generally gambling is a zero-sum game. It's not producing a good or service. So, I don't think it's inherently wrong, but I think it's just generally not something I think is the best for the people of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I live in Indiana. We actually already have sports betting. I've not participated in that. Again, I wouldn't say it's inherently wrong. Just not sure it's great for the people that are involved.
Go ahead. Said it as well. I think for some people it's a form of entertainment, but within reason, it can be a fun thing for people to do. People like to do bingos. They like to do all different kinds of things. And probably even sometimes in our churches, we've had roulette wheels and things like that to raise funds. Within reason, it's not always a bad thing, but unfortunately, like a lot of addictive behavior, as you've said, alcohol, it can be very destructive to people and families when it gets to be an addiction. And so I guess the other thing is, I just think of all the money that people spend on gambling, and especially with sports betting. And we're hurting for money for schools. We're hurting money for many charitable institutions and nonprofits. The money's out there, but we spend it on sometimes foolishness. And I have to say, I've placed a few horse bets in my day. Don't win much, but those kind of things. But I hope it's something we can tolerate, but I think we've got to be very careful about it. Later on, I know we'll probably do some questions about the restrictions on athletes. I think there's some questions there. But Joe, you got to have something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of fill in with what you all said. A Jewish perspective has always kind of looked at gambling in very practical terms. The Bible does not prohibit gambling. Having said that, Jewish tradition has historically frowned on gambling, not so much because of the act of gambling, but the associated vices that accompany it, so often. Things like cheating or taking advantage of another person's misfortune, or the lack of, I think some of you alluded to the lack of a contribution to society that's being made as opposed to work or mission or charity or things like that. Now, to be clear, they also put theater in this category and carnivals and, things like that. But having said that, where those concerns, those associated concerns have been well dealt with, the Jewish community or Jewish law has been more open. Where it hasn't been, it's been more controlled. Like, for instance, the stock market is gambling. I mean, you place a bet literally on a stock or when you make an investment. But because the stock market is well regulated, because it does contribute to the economy and society, because you're not necessarily taking it, people do well on the stock market and people do poorly, but you're not literally taking money off someone's side of the table. It's not viewed by most people or by Jewish law as a concern. State lotteries, as Clay said, again, well regulated, honest, hopefully well audited to make sure that the funds really do go to the cause that is created. It can be a benefit to society, as charitable gaming could be, but there's still the concerns of making sure the people who are involved in it don't become taken advantage by this. I mean, there are people, who buy a lottery ticket, for a pleasant $2, experience just to wonder if you're going to be the one who hits the millions. And there's other people who have addictions that really need to be addressed and can be taken advantage of by something like this. I don't gamble. I do go to the track and enjoy putting a $2 bet on horse racing. It's not gambling because I always lose. The one time I actually left Churchill Downs with more money than I went in, I gave it all to a homeless person on the street. And Rabbi Gelia was only upset about that because she would have preferred I gave it to a fireman in their boot for Crusade for Children. I think the key is not is there a moral vice or virtue here, but as Clay kind of started us off, there can be value that's drawn from it, and we don't just have to theoretically think about that. We have to look into it. I think that the governor has made a concerted effort to see to that this is done with as much value and concern about the issues of virtue as possible in the General Assembly as well. And I'm sure there'll be a refining process to make sure that actually works that way. But I think that it can be a net good for our society if it's managed well, and if we make sure that people don't get taken advantage of in the process.
Well, Joe, I was just looking at you. I'm reminded that you also were a featured eulogist for Muhammad Ali, the favorite son of Louisville, who participated in a very violent, questionable sport that was reeking with corruption over the years, many years. But he brought a level of virtue to a sport that was just saturated with vice and corruption. So he's exhibit A on some good that can come from an otherwise vice saturated enterprise. But he's an exception and not the rule. And I think that again, God has the power to bring good out of evil, as Joseph, the biblical Joseph said, what they mean for good, God can use for good. We know that. So, but I think overall, it's a cause for pause and concern. But there's some value in it, despite there being a lack of virtue in the enterprise as a whole. But I think that it's not something to be applauded just yet. Let's see just what the net result would be. Kentucky is a virtue. I mean, a vice, a virtued state. From bourbon to tobacco to horse racing. I mean, I mean, it's a as they say, vice virtue state. So that's what we do in the state of Kentucky. So if you take the vices out, you wouldn't have much to celebrate in bourbon country. So it is what it is. So we'll see how it plays out.
Let's not canonize the Hoosiers, though. Anyway,
I appreciate the reference to Ali. I mean, I think that's a really good example of a person of character can raise the situation and make a difference. And I think we all want to be that kind of person of character. That if we can all approach this as having intrinsic value, but having values that we need to uphold and be concerned with, that this can be by our efforts, a successful endeavor.
I'd like to bring up at least one of the issues there, and you mentioned it with Pete Rose, obviously several years ago. But when I was reading the article about the prohibition with athletes in colleges and NCAA, and some of the restrictions on that, but I was very interested. It said March Madness brackets and stuff like that. Well, gosh, that's a sport in Kentucky that probably all of us put our brackets in, and how are we going to regulate that? I mean, I think there's so many easy ways for people to get into trouble, and especially all of our student athletes in so many different colleges. Now, obviously, whether you're rooting for your own team or some team on the other side of the world is a little different, but that is a real question, and how that's all going to be regulated by colleges and all those kind of things. That gives me a moment for pause in terms of this. It looks like they've tried to do that well, but there's so much temptation in that area.
And I think for the average student, it's a very difficult. I mean, it's easy to brush this off. I mean, they can do sports betting until they graduate, until they enter an NCAA program, and they can do it immediately after they leave one. But in that block, you're not allowed to. Okay, and that's easy to brush it off unless you sit down and talk about the value, which is you have the ability to corrupt the system, and there's a value here, and there are consequences that could have consequences for you, for your team, for the school, for your future. And I think that we have a real obligation to be those people that can elevate the situation and see to it that the student athletes aren't the ones who end up being punished all the time when the system has possibilities for loss. So I really appreciate that, Joe. I think we need to educate these kids, and we need to stay around them so that they make good choices. Particularly in this period in their life where, in all fairness, they shouldn't be participating in this, even if it's not their own team. Because it's like insider information. More than the average person can. We share more, and again, it could really cost. In a lot of ways, it wouldn't be fair. So we really want to help them.
Seems like there's just consensus here. There's just a lot more potential for downside than upside. It seems to me.
But I think what sold this, of course, is it brings more money into the state rather than taxing people. I'm not sure that's the best way of running a state. And whether there's proportional taxing, that's another whole issue we don't need to get into. But whether it's lottery or whether it's sports gambling, that's not a way to run a government.
All right, panel, we're off to a good start, and thank you for your comments on that first topic here on Moral Side of the News. Second topic today, Mitch McConnell's health. Twice in recent weeks, he's become frozen at news conferences, unable to speak, standing silent for several seconds. We have compassion for anyone with a health issue. His health has prompted discussion about whether there should be an age limit for Congress. So, panel, my questions to you. Do we believe age equals wisdom, or is age irrelevant?
I think the age issue is kind of a false narrative here. I think the issue is health and ability. My mom's 88, and I aspire to her energy, wisdom, and commitment and involvement in the community in which she lives, and have all my life. We take better care of Mom right now than we used to have to worry about, because she was always taking care of us. But having said that, I don't think it's a question of a person's age. I know people who are fit, full, and leading regularly. And Mitch, generally speaking, has been one of those people. I'm not one. I pray for his good health. I'm not a political. I don't agree with Mitch on issues, often. But having said that, he's been a dedicated servant to this state, and I think we should all have prayers and hopes for his good health. But having said that, I think the health is the issue. I think we spend too much time talking about what the diagnosis is, and not enough time, worried about his own evaluation of whether or not he can really take the huge burden of responsibility that his job entails. And I think you need to take that seriously, because he's representing our state and he's representing the nation, as minority leader. And so I think his health matters. But I think it should matter not in the context of idle speculation, but in a context of his own consideration about how best to serve.
Well, I mean, to be honest and be clear, I appreciate you being so apparently kind in your comments about Mitch McConnell. But I want to be very clear. Mitch McConnell has not been kind to the poor. He's not been kind to those that are least able to afford health care. He's been a direct, ardent, strident enemy against Obamacare. He tried to destroy that health enterprise about those that don't have the privilege he has to acquire secure health themselves. So he's been a despicable representative for anyone else's health who is weak, who is poor, who is vulnerable. So to talk about a concern about the well-being of the likes of a Mitch McConnell, I don't want to be a hypocrite to claim that I don't want no harm, direct harm, to come to him. But he has been a strident enemy of health for so many vulnerable and weak people over the years, in so many ways. And as far as him being frozen, I think that's a poetic representation of his political contribution. Has been frozen in time. He has not been supportive of anything that's progressive. He has not been a proponent of anything be supportive that goes to making life better for those that cannot secure life for themselves. So I think it is what it is. Time brings about a change. At least that's some virtue in time that the page will turn. And even though the constituents in Kentucky cannot turn the page, Father Time surely will. So as far as his health, I think his health and him being freezing on camera is just a metaphor for how he has operated in the political arena in the Senate for so many years.
Well, I think our question basically was about the age factor, and I don't think you can assume that because you're 81 or our Pope Francis is 86 years old, who blows my mind what he can do at 86. I don't think I'll be doing that at 86 at all. But I mean, I think there always is a time in which we need to pass it on to another generation. And in this day and age, when I've got several friends recently that have got early stages of dementia, some quite a bit younger and some older, and it's like, I'm not saying McConnell has that, but I think our capacities are not as great at certain ages, and there needs to be time when you need to hang it up, but it's not necessarily based on how many years you've got or how fast you walk or whatnot, but how you deal with people and how you deal with issues and how you listen and how you articulate. And I've got two priest friends who were 94 and 95. I said, God, if my mind is half as sharp as theirs is at that age, I would be thrilled. So it's not how many years, but the quality of work that you can do or still be able to do, but you need to know when to quit too.
Yeah, and I think this is a bipartisan issue. So we have what's going on with Mitch McConnell, but I think the whole nation can acknowledge it's an issue with Joe Biden. And to the point, it's not an age issue. It's an issue with John Fetterman. It's a question of capacity and capability and it's not inherently an age problem. So I think we're in agreement on that. And again, I think it's a bipartisan problem. I think we can name people in both parties. I learned a new word this week. It's I messed it up now. It's can someone pronounce it? Do you guys know the word?
Gerontology? No.
Thank you. Yeah, gerontocracy. And yeah. And but that's highlighting age. But I don't think it's an age issue. I do think it is a capability issue. And I think the issue's clear. The solutions are not necessarily easy. But these people that we're mentioning should not be creating or enforcing policy at this point. As sad as that is, and I think our sympathies do go out to these folks living their life, their career out in the public eye. But one other thing that just kind of caught my attention with this story is it's evidence of how entrenched we are in our two-party system. We have several people in office right now where we can see folks would rather settle for someone who is unable to do the job than someone from the other party. And I think we're so entrenched in holding our political power through our politicians. We have people holding on to these spots way too long. I think potentially term limits could help address some of this, but it wouldn't address all of it. But yeah, it's sad, it's unfortunate, but I think it's a real issue. I do agree that I think it's more a matter of capacity than age.
Very good panel. That's a good topic. We'll move on to a third topic on this program, Moral Side of the News. We've got about 7 minutes left. A clearing spree is underway in Metro Louisville, according to the Courier-Journal. Homeless camp clearings have increased dramatically since Mayor Craig Greenberg took office in January. A count led by the Coalition for the Homeless found nearly 600 people living outdoors. That's a 140% increase from last year. Panel, let's hear your thoughts on how to help.
Well, compassion always helps. Putting yourself in someone else's position, trading places with someone else always helps. That's a good starting point. My daughter lives in Atlanta. She lives in a fairly nice neighborhood in Marietta, and occasionally they camp out in the backyards in a tent. Now, they do that by choice, but they enjoy the experience for 1 or 2 days top. But living that way always is something else. I'll share with you, John, as I came on the air, my house caught on fire about 2.5 years ago. So I've been virtually living as a nomad the last 2.5 years. So even though I've had a roof over my head, but I have not been I don't have my own bed, don't have my own house. So I've been virtually homeless for 2.5 years, even though it has not been outside. But I can feel, because I've gone through a similar experience, what it's like to be displaced from someplace. And even Jesus said, birds of the air have nests, foxes have holes, but the Son of Man have no place to lay his head. We must acknowledge that he himself did not have a mailing address, a permanent mailing address that he could receive mail if he needed it. So I think it's a time to be compassionate, whatever we do. And I think with the homeless situation in Louisville, I've never seen it as I've seen it in the last, say, 10 years in my whole lifetime. I've never seen that in Louisville, Kentucky. So it's clearly a harbinger of a changing times in which we live. And I think it begs that we need to respond in some way. It goes back to politics again. One of the greatest policies that was voted on in the Mitch era and Trump era was tax cuts for the rich. There was no emphasis on looking out for the poor. So the virtue focus was out of balance even there. So I think our society is almost always out of balance when it comes to the poor. The haves always have the advantages, and the have-nots have less so. So I think that is the real message for me, is that to be concerned and try to trade places with those that are less fortunate.
I appreciate that voice of compassion. I really do, Clay. And I think that's what's missing in the conversation all too often. The homeless don't disappear when they get moved out of sight. They're people. They live somewhere. And there are, particularly in these miserably cold and unbelievably hot, seasons that we've endured in these past few years, it's only become more and more difficult to be homeless on the street. There are reasons why people are homeless, and we need to address those reasons. I mean, there are veterans, a very high percentage of veterans in the homeless community, and we need to serve our veterans better. There are mental health issues, and we need to have more, more resources to address those. There are daycare problems and drug care problems and child care problems that make homelessness endemic. They're always going to be poor, and it's the measure of a society as to how we're going to care for the poor and the most needy in our community, and we are failing by that measure, and we need to do better.
I think homelessness, Louisville has had a great reputation over the last 20 or 30 years because we've had a lot of facilities that have tried to help the poor and coalitions like Coalition for the Homeless. Obviously, with the pandemic and a lot of the problems with jobs and all that kind of stuff, that's caused a lot more homelessness. What the statistic was, 140% increase over the last year in people living outdoors. But and unfortunately, a lot of these camps look like a mess and all that kind of stuff, and they don't help the looks of our city. I certainly understand that question, and the sanitation and lack of sanitation, all that kind of stuff. But just cleaning it up or getting rid of them without an alternative place. I thought in the article you gave us, there were several suggestions that, maybe there's some public land or something like that where we could truly help these people rather than just cleaning up those kind of things. We've got to think out of the box and more creatively. Of course, that might be more money. And Lord knows now that we got more sports betting, we've got all kinds of money to deal with. We'll see how that goes. But homelessness is a critical issue. Our churches try to do, and congregations, synagogues try to do a lot of good work, but it takes a lot more money than we can always raise.
David, I'll let you have the last word. We've got about a minute left.
All right. Well, I think you guys have hit on some important things. Homelessness is such a complicated issue. It's something every society through history has had to deal with at some level. And I think, yes, compassion's at the heart of it. I think one of the big tensions between progressives and conservatives is, how do we give that compassion? I think often some folks want to think compassion is just tolerance or making it comfortable. And I think that's not ultimately compassionate. I think finding solutions that are not simply just making people more comfortable in the situation they're in ultimately is better. Our church, I just want to plug this, supports Recenter Ministries on Jeff Street. Homeless, it's a center for men. It's a residential program where men can get help and support. And I love supporting that. When we pass folks on the street, men on the street needing help, we can always offer that. And I believe in the kind of help they're giving.
A great way to end our program this week, Moral Side of the News. Thank you to Joe Rooks, Rapport, David Harkleroad, Clay Calloway, and Joe Graffis. We'll have an all-new conversation next week. Thanks for watching and listening to Moral Side of the News. Thank you, panel.